Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. Not sure if it was a Wendigo, but something odd happened. When I was 8 years old, both of my parents worked full-time. My dad was predominantly on third shift at his job, and my mom was an elementary school teacher. We lived literally right up the road from my grandparents in a very small town. It was getting close to my 9th birthday when I contracted strep throat and scarlet fever. I was severely sick, could barely speak, had the first case of cold sweats that I remember in my life, and could barely pull myself out of bed to even use the restroom. I was absolutely miserable, and of course, being as young as I was, I didn't take the pain very well. My poor mother was at a loss of what to do with her working, and my dad needing to use daylight hours to sleep. The first day I was sick, perhaps it was a Tuesday, my birthday would fall on a Friday. My dad stayed up most of the day with me, made me food, let me sleep in his lap on the couch, wiped my forehead down, made sure I took my medicine, etc. But on the second day, my grandmother had called and offered to let me stay at her house so my dad could sleep. He said yes and woke me up around 7 that morning to drive me up to her home. My grandfather also worked at this time too, so he was already gone to work when I arrived there. I don't remember too much of the early morning. I probably just slept in my grandmother's bed, tossing and turning when I'd wake up feeling extra bad. She encouraged me to swallow my awful-tasting medicine a little more gently than my dad did. She did fix me some tomato soup to try and eat, and it was the first time since I'd gotten sick that I had an appetite. I should mention my grandmother had this cute Yorkshire Terrier named Samson. He was very docile, not like the usual annoying, barking all the time terriers. Samson came into the room and curled up next to me as I dozed. I do know when I woke up at some point, it had to be the early afternoon/lunchtime because I could hear the TV faintly from the living room on some game show. My grandmother had a ritual of eating her lunch while watching a game show. I think it was The Price is Right. I was trying to fall back asleep because I had gotten this really bad headache, maybe from dehydration. I was on the verge of sleep when I was jolted awake by the Samson yelp that erupted from the living room. The terrier curled up next to my feet, perked up, but didn't move. I knew I had heard his name being called too, but it was odd he didn't respond. Samson. My grandmother called again. Samson. Samson. The dog still didn't run out of the room to her. I was confused as he was so obedient to my grandmother. He was almost frozen, staring at the cracked open door but making no attempt to go to her. She called Samson, maybe 3 or 4 more times. Then I got annoyed. I remember flinging the covers off of me. Of course my clothes are sticky with sweat, and I just generally feel uncomfortable and groggy. I stumble out of the room wiping my eyes, asking Grandma, "Do you need Samson?" "He's in your room with me." I'm in the living room, and I have to do a double take. The TV is still on and blaring. There's a bowl of soup sitting on the coffee table and an open Pepsi next to it, but my grandmother isn't anywhere in the room. Maybe she's in the bathroom? I crossed the room and went past the kitchen, empty too. I got to the bathroom door, which was shut, and knocked. Nothing. I then opened it. No one was in there. The house is empty. It's not a huge house either. I've covered all of the rooms. So yes, my first reaction was to get scared. I could clearly hear my grandmother calling for the dog, but she's not anywhere inside. I can feel my hands and feet get all tingly. I start shouting for my grandma, but my voice is just echoing through the small, cramped home. Samson had gotten up at this point and was sitting near the couch, looking completely undisturbed. I fumbled for the remote and turned the TV off and yelled, more like wheezed, to the top of my lungs, which you can imagine how painful this was with a scratchy, infected throat. Grandma. The worst part happened next. I heard her shouting my name back, clear as ever, like she was standing only feet away. I start crying now, scared out of my mind. I feel like maybe it has to be a ghost. I grew up with scary ghost stories courtesy of my dad, and I'm convinced now I'm in the room with a ghost. And then she / whatever this was, proceeded to call my name again. Then there was a second voice, definitely not my grandmother's. It was deeper, definitely more masculine, and absolutely terrifying as it shouted, "Come to the front door." I did not do that. Instead, I made sure to run back to my grandparents' bedroom, lock the door, and pick up the telephone on their nightstand. I called my own home phone, and my dad's sleepy voice answered. Through a barely comprehensible voice, I managed to croak something like, "Daddy, there's someone in the house, and I can't find Grandma. She's gone." My dad, of course, said he jumped out of bed, grabbed his Swiss Army knife he kept in a drawer next to the bed, and ran down the road to the house in his PJs and bare feet. He ran up to the front door, jiggled the handle. It was locked. So he made his way around, and since he knew the garage code, just punched it in and got inside. A quick sweep of the 3 rooms of the home showed no one was in there. It's not like there was really anywhere to hide. I ran out of the room once I was sure he was there and began bawling in his arms. He kept reassuring me there was no one here, and then asked if I did know where Grandma possibly was. I said I hadn't, and explained I'd woken up to her calling for Samson, but she hadn't been anywhere there. This was back when cell phones were definitely around, but there were no iPhones, and my grandparents certainly wouldn't have been buying them anyway. My dad had one, but not on him at the time. I could tell he was trying to keep calm, so he just said we would need to go back to our house. I was sure he was probably going to call the police at that point, just because my grandma still hadn't popped up and her car had been in the garage when he got in. If she'd left, she'd gone on foot. We hadn't even made 2 steps out of the driveway when from my grandma's neighbor's house, my grandma was strolling out, chatting to the neighbor. She saw my dad and then me, crying my eyes out, and immediately ran over to see what was wrong. She was super apologetic. She said she'd stepped out right when she'd heated up her soup to go see her neighbor, who'd called about looking at something my grandma was going to buy. My grandma had figured I was asleep, and she'd only be gone for 10 or 15 minutes. At first, people may have assumed I was feverish, therefore delusional, but I still stand by what happened. I know for a fact I was definitely alone in the house, save for Samson, but the voices I heard were real. For a while I was hesitant to go back to my grandma's house, because this happened in the middle of the day. I later read stories at school about Wendigos, or creatures that would disguise their voices to lure people. This was the closest explanation I could ever form about what I heard. I never shared to anyone that I thought it was for sure a Wendigo, and chalked it up to maybe just a ghost. I'm close to my 20s now. Last year was the first time I shared this story fully to my grandpa, who used to just say the fever must have made me had bad dreams. We were sitting on the front porch of the house, smoking cigarettes and exchanging anecdotes. When I finished telling him, for the first time he looked sort of disturbed about it. He finally put his cigarette out and just stared out into the road. Then he cleared his throat and looked over at me. "You know," he said slowly, "some funny things used to happen around that time. In the middle of the night, I'd wake up to take a piss or something. When I'd first sit up in the bed, I could hear your grandma sleeping away, snoring." He chuckled, but his face grew serious again. "Anyways, I'd always hear her calling for the dog. I tried to remain looking calm, but my voice still shook when I asked him, even when she was sleeping. Sleep talking. No, he shook his head. I heard her calling from outside, maybe the living room. I don't know, honey. She'd call for the dog, she'd call my name. All while she was really sleeping next to me, sleeping like a baby. Have you ever told anyone? No, I don't want to scare her. She's real scared of ideas like ghosts and stuff. That's why when you were younger and that thing happened, I told her just to remember you'd been sick, fever and all. Probably having nightmares. He looked gravely at me. Don't repeat this to her, please. Honey, she's really not the type to be scaring. Of course, I wanted to cry. I had this itchy, creepy feeling suddenly about being at the house. Grandpa, do you still hear it sometimes? Oh yes, he was now reaching into his breast pocket to get out another cigarette. Every night, but you just gotta remember not to do what it says. Even the dog figured it out. If it says to come to the door, you stay away from the door. If it says, I dunno, come here, you just stay still in the room until it quits calling. With that, he asked to borrow my lighter again. Second story. Encounter in the woods. Encounter in the woods. A true story. Puffalump. This happened to me about 11 years ago when I was 14. Thinking about it now still brings up the same intense eerie feeling that makes my eyes water. I grew up in the rain-soaked evergreen forests of the Olympic Peninsula, Washington. I was backpacking and hiking in those woods from the time I could walk and usually feel at ease on the trail alone as long as I have a faithful dog around. One wet, misty fall evening, I decided to take my dog Kayla on a bike ride with me along a dirt road near my house. Kayla was an extremely intelligent golden retriever, very friendly but fiercely protective when she needed to be. She usually stayed within 30 feet in front of me whenever we went running or biking. The dirt road was crowded by thick Douglas fir trees, needles saturated with dew. It was still fairly light outside, but the trees looming overhead enshrouded much of the roadway from the sky. About 2 miles down the road, Kayla suddenly halted, her hackles raising. Planting her legs in an aggressive stance, she began to growl ferociously. At this point, I had stopped my bike and stood about 15 feet away from her. 40 feet ahead, there was an offshoot from the road, a small overgrown set of tracks that looked like it was rarely used. Tall grass sprouted from the center. The forest had reclaimed most of it, and it was too dark to see much past the entrance. Just to the side of the road next to the entrance, there was a pile of junk pouring out of a shredded black trash bag, and what looked to be a ragged brown rug piled on top of it. It was then that I noticed the smell, a thick, rotting stench that assaulted my senses. Sometimes people would come out into the remote woods to dump their trash. At first, I thought my dog was being stupid, growling at the rug thinking it was an animal. But I knew she was too smart for that, and a feeling of dread crept up my spine. Something was watching us from the shadows of the overgrown road. Whatever it wasn't human, or she wouldn't be growling rabidly. If it were a small animal, she would already have it in her jaws. I called her name sharply, hoping she would move closer to me, away from the entrance. As I was looking at Kayla, I heard branches cracking and rustling in the darkness ahead. My eyes darted toward the sound. Something big moved across the tracks, entering the woods on the side closest to us, crashing through the wall of branches. I couldn't make out the full shape, but it was huge, at least as large as a bear and covered in thick, dark fur. It almost looked as if it was running upright, but I saw so little of it I wasn't sure what I was seeing. Adrenaline shot through my veins. Kayla, come now. I screamed, tears of terror filling my eyes. I whipped my bike around and pedaled furiously, fear fueling every thrust of my feet. I could hear Kayla's 4 paws scattering the dirt as she galloped behind me. I didn't turn to see if it had emerged behind me. All I could think of was how glad I was to not be on foot. It felt like an eternity until I finally arrived on our safe, grassy lawn. I tossed my bike aside and slammed open the front door, startling my older brother in the kitchen. Words breathlessly tumbled out of my mouth as I tried to explain what happened, that I didn't know what I saw. He didn't believe me, insisting that it was probably just a stray dog or something, and the dim light was playing tricks on me, or I was just making shit up. He said he would go check it out. I pleaded with him not to go, and he must have seen the glint of genuine fear in my eyes. He said he would take the car. Though I was still shaking with adrenaline and fear, I didn't want him to go alone. We would be safe in the car, right? Just as we were heading out the door, my petite mother emerged from downstairs, asking what the ruckus was about. I'm still not sure why my mother, who locks herself in her room at the sight of a centipede, wanted to go look for some strange large animal in the woods. My brother stepped into the garage and grabbed the first weapon he could find, my dad's machete. We shut Kayla inside the house and piled into our trusty old 80s Honda. The tires crunched as they ground small rocks further into the dirt along the road. Slowly we crept up on the abandoned path. That's where I saw it. It ran across there. We sat there for a moment, stopped about 20 feet away, then my brother cracked open the door. "What are you doing?" I whispered. "If there was anything here, it's probably long gone now. I want to look for tracks." I told myself he was probably right. The thing had plenty of time to leave. I slowly stepped out of the car. All three of us moved cautiously toward the path, peering at the dirt. The overpowering stench I had smelled before was even stronger now, and a wave of nausea passed over me. We were only about 10 feet from the car when a low, angry growl emanated from the trees ahead. I had never heard anything like it before or since. It was a deep and powerful growl that almost sounded more like someone saying ee at a very low, rumbling bass pitch. It lasted maybe a full 5 seconds. All of us froze simultaneously. I don't know why, but I blurted out softly, "Did you hear that?" Which seemed to jolt everyone from their trance at once. "Holy shit," whispered my brother. We leapt toward the car in unison, my brother slamming the door shut while cranking the stick into reverse and hitting the gas. The short drive home was silent, and there was very little said for the rest of the night. I did not venture into the woods near my house for months afterwards. My brother is now an experienced backwoods hunter and woodsman, and still says he has no idea what produced the noise we heard. He now always brings his trusty .357 revolver with him whenever he goes near the woods for protection from whatever aggressive creatures he may encounter in the dense forest of Washington. Third story. I think there is a Wendigo in the Minnesota woods. First things first, I wasn't there, but I was the first person he told. This happened in southeast Minnesota. I am not going to be telling the exact location, but it was in a smallish forest on a long bike trail. One more quick thing. It was really windy this day. My friend, who we will call S, and his father were on a bike ride. It was about a 12-mile bike ride. So they are doing their thing when about 5 miles and S sees what he thinks is a deer. They keep going and S sees a flash of brown next to them in the trees, and it is like this thing is running next to them. Like keeping pace, but he doesn't hear anything. He points it out to his dad, and his father says that it's probably a deer, but he agrees it is really weird, so they keep going. They get to this little beach where they usually rest and look at the river. S notices something feels off. He notices that first of all, there is no tree swaying. Secondly, there is no animal noises. Then he realizes he didn't see any animals the whole time they were there, except the deer. The silence was heavy. It was like every animal left. The woods were silent. S tells his dad that he isn't feeling very well and that he wants to go home. His dad begrudgingly agrees. They get on their bikes and S is almost hyper-aware of his surroundings. They go for a while until S sees a flash of brown again and antlers. They keep going until they hit this clearing. The clearing looks like a big field with trees around it and a bike trail through it. As they enter the clearing, S looks back, and there's the fucking beast standing on its hind legs, and he said it was like 9 feet tall. It had antlers, and it looked like it had a deer head or some shit. He said he was terrified. They finally got out of the woods and the wind was back, and there was animal noises again. I think this was a Wendigo, but I am not sure. I honestly don't know if I believe him, but we are in Minnesota and it wouldn't be impossible. But are we a bit too far south for Wendigos? If you have any ideas or theories, please let me know. Okay, apparently I haven't hit the minimum word count, so I'll give you more minor details. We are pretty much at the bottom of Minnesota. Nowhere close to Rosisu, Minnesota. Like I said, it was really windy this day, like really windy. I think S is kinda sensitive to the paranormal. Just a little bit. Although the Wendigo isn't really paranormal. They have been biking on this trail before. They didn't go the whole way, they went about half. I think it is too short to be a Wendigo. Is it possible it is a skinwalker? I looked on a map, and the tribes that were in this area were the Dakota Sioux. This area usually has a lot of wildlife. It was before noon when this happened. He didn't see any other people other than him and his dad. Neither of us know what to think about this. I'll ask him about what it smelled like or if it smelled weird in the area. Fourth story. There is something evil in the woods. It all started 2 months ago, and I can't keep it to myself any longer. My friends and family listened to me with interest at the beginning, but by now they roll their eyes and grow impatient when I bring up the thing living in the woods. I'll give some context and then try my best to describe the horrors that have been unfolding. I live right on the edge of an enormous forest, and I mean it when I say it is huge. The number of endangered species that live in these woods means that nobody can build or live in it, and hiking off the trails is strictly prohibited. Although the forest is miles and miles deep, if you want to follow the law, then you are restricted to a trail that follows the edge of the forest and hardly shows you anything. It is also known that Native Americans used to live in these woods, and hikers happen across arrowheads there sometimes. Well, lately I've been going through a bad breakup and spending a lot of time alone for a change. I've found that the only way I can truly forget my problems and my depression for a little while is to hike in the woods and explore. I had been leaving my house with a backpack loaded with some snacks and water, as well as my knife and a joint to smoke. Like I said, my house is a little isolated and right on the edge of the woods, so I walk about 200 yards and I am there. Lately, I had made a habit of heading off the trail and directly into the woods, going slightly deeper with each hike. I rarely saw anyone on the trail in the first place, so I wasn't worried about getting caught off the trail by anybody. Plus, I have survival experience in case anything happened. It helped me put things in perspective to be out in nature alone. Plus, sometimes I would happen across a really great view, or something cool like an old chair or an ancient can of beans. So this day is no different. I left my house with my backpack and headed to the forest. It didn't take long until I was off the trail and heading deep into the woods. The sun was out, but the trees are so tall and thick that it seems dark even on a bright day. A couple rays of sunshine managed to break through the canopy of branches and leaves, providing a nice contrast to the dark stillness of the forest below. I took in the sights and walked through the woods almost entirely through mechanical instinct. My mind was miles away, focused on my troubles and how upset I was about life at that moment. I was in a dark place that day, and even hiking wasn't breaking me out of it. I think being so mentally distracted is what led me to hike further than I ever intended to, and way further than I had ever gone before. I might have even taken several wrong turns from my usual landmarks. I don't even know. All I know is what happened soon after. I had been walking for at least another 45 minutes or an hour before I consciously realized that I was lost. I usually followed a creek or looked at the mountains in the distance for reference, but at this point I was actually at the base of the mountain. It stood before me, craggy and barren with less trees and more rocks the further you climbed. It was the first mountain of the mountain range, and behind me was the dense and dark forest. I cursed myself for hiking this far in a daze, because judging from the sun, I only had about an hour of good sunlight left in the day before the woods started getting really creepy. Quickly, I decided to get a vantage point on the mountain so that I could see which way was home. I found a nice overlook a little ways above the tree line and found the direction I needed to head back in. This calmed my nerves a bit, and I decided it was a good spot to take a break. I gulped down a bottle of water and ate some snacks as I admired the view. I loved how the tops of the trees stretched as far as the eye could see, hiding everything going on below. It was the humbling perspective I was looking for. I began smoking a joint before heading back, feeling my buzz get stronger as I scanned the horizon aimlessly. I was nearly done with the joint when my eyes settled on what looked like the biggest cat I had ever seen in my life wandering around in the clearing, just 40 feet down where I had just come from. Being high, it took me a moment to realize I was looking at a mountain lion that was easily the size of a large dog or bigger. My blood ran cold. The second my fear kicked in, it's like this animal sensed it. It peered up at where I was sitting from below and promptly darted out of sight, exactly towards where I had been able to climb up from. At this point, I am freaking the hell out. I knew that thing was coming to get me. I felt it in my gut that I was now being hunted. If you have ever felt this kind of fear, it is the most overwhelming, panicky feeling you will ever have. Time moves slowly, but at the same time your mind is freaking out and it is very easy to slip up and make a mistake. I grabbed my backpack, leaving behind all of my trash and snacks, and immediately begin running down mountain from the side opposite where I came from. I know I slipped at least twice from my busted knees and the chunk missing from my left palm, but at the moment I was feeling no pain and was entirely focused on getting home as fast as possible. I got down that hillside faster than I had ever moved before in my life. I truly wish I could end my story here and have it just be about a mountain lion. I really do. But when I reached the bottom of the mountain and was ready to haul ass in the direction of home, I got the most evil and horrible feeling that I was being watched. I ignored every instinct to run away and decided to look behind me. What I saw haunts me. About 40 or so feet up the mountainside, at the exact spot I was smoking and eating it moments ago, stands an old Native American man. Even from where I am standing, I can see his rugged, bark-colored skin and his unkempt silver hair. He is wearing a robe of what appears to be animal skins adorned with feathers, like someone from a different era. I notice that he is staring directly at me, and he is very, very mad. There were tears running down his face, but his eyes were unblinking and fixated on me in a complete rage. I have never seen such evil and hatred in my entire life. His eyes were bugging out of his face, and his mouth was fixed in a horrible grimace. His arms were stuck at his sides, but his shoulders were shaking violently, his entire body rocking in place. And he was angry and staring directly at me. Staring at this person seemed like an eternity, even though it was probably just 5 seconds in reality. I turned and bolted. I was completely terrified. I was tearing through the woods, getting cut up by branches when I heard a horrifying screech/scream just a short ways behind me. It sounded like a beast and a human at the same time, as well as sounded completely angry yet sad at the same time. I was losing my mind with fear. I was ready at any moment to die some sort of horrible fate. I had no idea what was after me at this point or what was going to happen. And then I heard another scream, even angrier and louder than before. I'm not proud to admit that I shat my pants during all of this. I am running like an Olympic athlete through the woods at this point. I hardly even remember how long I was running, but eventually I broke through the woods and found myself on a country road that I knew was several miles from my home. It was nearly completely dark now. Being on the road didn't satisfy me, as I kept running down the road, putting distance between me and the forest. As I ran, I managed to get phone out and clumsily dial the closest person in my contacts list, my neighbor Phil. Hello. Hey Phil, I'm really in a bit of an emergency and was wondering if you could pick me up at the road I was on. I'd really appreciate you. Also, could you bring a gun just in case? The comment about the gun seemed to really put him on edge. Wait, why? What's going on? It's nothing. I just think there might be a large animal or a predator out here, and it's getting dark. Phil seemed to get the urgency because I heard his truck door slam while he agreed to come pick me up. I thanked him sincerely and stayed on the phone with him while I waited for him to get there. It felt like an eternity, but soon enough his truck pulled up and I hopped inside. Phil seemed both wary and irritated that I had him rush out to pick me up, but I couldn't care less. I was just thankful to be heading home at that point. Phil quickly seemed to realize that I had defecated myself, but had the decency to not say anything. He asked me what the hell happened and why I was such a bloody mess. I told him that I was hiking and got stalked by a mountain lion and fled, as he nodded in understanding. But once I mentioned that I thought I saw an old Native American man, the energy in the vehicle completely changed. I could practically feel Phil's arm hairs raise. Have you ever seen anyone like that around here? I asked him. He paused before replying, as if chewing on his words before deciding what to say. No, but I don't think you should go out that ways ever again. You're asking for trouble. The car fell silent right as I realized we were pulling up to my house. I thanked Phil again and said goodnight as I shut the truck door and started walking up my driveway. My house is rather isolated, so there are no street lights or neighbors close by, and I hadn't turned on my porch lights before leaving. Thankfully, it was a full moon, and my driveway and lawn were illuminated in a soft nocturnal glow. It had surprising visibility, partly due to the moon and partly because I had been outside as it grew dark. I had all but forgotten about what happened in the woods. My mind could only focus on how happy I was to be safe and home. I walked through my front door and gave one last look outside and saw him. The old Native American man was standing at the foot of my driveway. It was night, but I immediately knew it was him, from the body shape and from the angry, almost demonic body and shoulder swaying. Holy shit! I yell as I slam the door, triple lock it, and run to my room on the second floor. I locked my bedroom door, grabbed my gun from the nightstand, and locked myself in the bathroom closet. I laid there panting and seizing with my gun pointed at the door for what might have actually been hours until I somehow fell asleep. I woke up the next morning feeling immediate anxiety and fear. My body was covered in dried blood and scratches from the night before, and my loaded gun lay next to me on the floor. I picked it up and reluctantly did a sweep of the entire house, feeling like I was being watched the entire time. Even when I searched every room, I felt like I couldn't relax, so I decided to look around outside of the house. What I found horrifies me. There were claw marks about 3 feet off the ground on both the front door and the back door. Something monstrous had tried getting in last night. I just hadn't heard because I was on the second story locked in the closet. I really have no explanation for what I experienced, but things have actually been getting freakier since then. About 2 weeks later, I began finding dead animals in front of the door when I came home. At first, it was just a squirrel here or there, but the last animal that was left was a cat. Weirdest part is that there are no wounds or blood on the corpse. They just show up dead, like their necks were snapped or they were poisoned. I'm thoroughly freaked out and have thought about calling the police, but without any evidence they couldn't do anything. I also live in an isolated forest area, so even if I asked them to patrol by my house, it would be unrealistic. I've even considered selling my home and moving, but I can't bring myself to simply uproot like that. I've been trying to research the forest history and whether any crimes have occurred or people have gone missing, but I haven't found anything. Even trying to talk to friends and family is fruitless since they think I'm losing my mind once I mentioned a Native American man. There is one friend I talk to who believes me, but he wants to go with me back to the spot and try to confront this thing/person. This idea terrifies me, but I feel like I must do something. The bodies are showing up more and more frequently, and I feel like it's only going to get worse. Fifth story. Wendigo encounter. Hi, so this is my first post on Reddit. I just wanted to share this story and see if something like this has ever happened to anyone else. Just to start off with some backstory. My group of friends had started making a nasty habit of joking about the Wendigo. My friend Stacy and me didn't for a while just due to the fact we believed in the supernatural. But after a few months it grew on us, and not knowing that the Wendigo can actually be triggered by such things, we joined in. Biggest mistake ever. I had just moved into the country, and we enjoyed making trips into town to have a few drinks, which is about a 30-minute walk from my place to town. At night, the first 10 minutes after leaving the bridge that leads out of town is pitch darkness with no streetlights. After that, streetlights are very sparsely places, which can cause for a very creepy walk back without anything happening. So with that all in place, let's continue. Stacy and I begin our night, walking into town, get some beers, and have some fun. Shortly into the night, something slightly strange happens. We receive a phone call from her little sister at home crying and scared because she saw someone sitting on my friend Stacy's bed. She calms her sister down and asks her cousin to check her room for her sister at home. Everything is fine. No one's in the room. Also, ghosts and weird things happening at her house were very common, so a sighting like this was strangely regular. We continue our night. Into the night, we meet a guy who seems pretty cool. He's riding a bike and tells us he's pretty drunk or something. We decide to hang with him for a bit, wanting to meet people in town. A ways into our hangout, we are sitting on a park bench, and the guy is laying on the ground in front of us. Suddenly, my friend stands up and says it's time for us to go. I shrug and agree, and we get going. After getting away from him, she tells me how the guy bit her ankle the day after she had teeth bruises on her ankle. Kind of flustered the guy would do that, we continue our walk out of town. Finally, we pass the bridge, which is our last source of light for the next 10 minutes. We turn on our phone flashlights, and we turn on some music trying to ease the spooky feeling of being in pitch darkness in the middle of nowhere. Suddenly, we hear a voice beside us. We both jump. It's the same guy on his bike. He asks us if he can follow us until we reach the fork in the road. We need to go left, and he needs to go right. Still slightly creeped out, but almost at the street lights and the fork in the road, we agree. Regardless, he had to go that way, and so did we. After a bit of walking, we finally reach the fork in the road and the first street light. We sigh with relief, hoping he would leave. But he turns down our way instead of going the way he needs to go. Now at this point, we are thoroughly creeped out. We try to ignore it and keep walking, holding our breaths, wanting to reach the next streetlight, which is some ways away. Finally, after what felt like forever, we reach the next streetlight, which is also for some reason a small graveyard. I hate my area. Once we reach the street light, the guy stops dead in his tracks and doesn't move any further past it. As we turn around, the guy looks like he has suddenly passed out on his bike, his head down and shoulders slumped. I was about to say something to him, but my friend stopped me and said we really needed to leave him. I agreed, not wanting to be around him much longer either. After a few seconds, I take a peek over my shoulder. He's gone, vanished. The worst part is, even if he had turned around and started pedaling as fast as he could, we still would have been able to see him some ways down the road. I panicked, but also slightly relieved he wasn't there anymore. We continue walking, trying to pretend we aren't creeped out, walking quickly from street light to street light. Finally, we reach my driveway. My driveway is a long road of darkness, We hadn't put any lights in yet to try and brighten it. We began to walk slowly, holding our breath, some weird feeling of dread coming over me the closer and closer we got to my house and the further into the driveway we entered. I don't know what came over us, but the sudden feeling of you need to run, and you need to run fast, came over us at the same time. We took off bolting at the exact same time without having to say a word to each other. We got to my front door. I unlocked it quicker than I ever have before. We get inside. Just as I'm about to close the door, this hellish scream or growl, whatever the sound, has come out of nowhere. I could hear it getting close to the door and steps. I slammed the door closed and locked it and dropping to the ground in fear. We both sat there holding our breath, scared to even breathe. Fast forward a couple weeks, me and my Stacy had forgotten about what happened. Suddenly it came up in convo, and we tried to find the sound we heard. Nothing worked. We looked up every possible animal, even animals that weren't likely. We spent an hour on this, until we decided to look up the sound of a Wendigo. It was the only sound that fit perfectly. We don't joke or talk about it now. I want to hate to. Even writing this post made me feel scared to bring it up. Sixth story. Message from a Wendigo. I have been trapped here for too long. I can never forget the day I was taken. It was the dead of night. I had just killed my prey, a woman who had been foolish enough to wander into my home. I remember how happy I was that day, that I did not have to hunt. Instead, the food brought itself to me. If only I had known then that my delight would soon turn into terror. The men came into my home and overpowered me. There were 3 of them. They were large, much larger than the normal men I hunted. Perhaps in different circumstances, I would have killed and consumed them. But I was injured at the time. Not a grave injury, but it impeded me still. I had received the wound a week before from a particularly resilient man. He had beat at my foot with a rock, damaging my ankle, even as I straddled his chest, tearing his throat open. Looking back, I still find myself appreciating the man's sheer will, but I appreciated his flesh much more. Even without the injury, the men would have been difficult to conquer. As I said, they were large, but not only that. They were carrying strange metal poles. They were warriors of some kind. The poles fired darts that struck me and made me drowsy. The men threw me into a metal carriage that moved by means I knew not, and still do not know. It was within this carriage I lost consciousness. I awoke, I know not when, in a metal cage. I was still in a slight daze. There were men all around, all just as large as the 3 who had attacked me. Initially, I was ecstatic. I was surrounded by food, and I did not see any of the men who had taken me. These ones did not have any metal poles, so they were easy prey. But when I attempted to escape, I found myself unable to damage the cage in any way. I shrieked and roared and bashed at the cage. The men flinched in fear, and some pulled smaller metal objects from pouches at their hips. I drew myself to my full height, still towering above the men, despite them being larger than the ones I was accustomed to. I felt something hit me in my back, and I turned my head to see another dart had struck me. One of the men who had taken me had been behind me the whole time, on the other side of the cage, and he had fired another dart at me. Once again, I fell unconscious. When I awoke again, I was in a room. It was larger than the cage I had previously been, 10 paces wide and double across. But this one did not offer the commodity of being able to see out of it. The walls were hard stone, and the door a harder metal. I tried to break out for hours, but I could not. I laid upon the ground, only thinking of my hunger. I was utterly ravenous. Whether it was morning, noon, or night, I had no way of knowing. All I knew was how famished I was. Even if only one day had passed since I had last eaten, it still would have been one day too many without food. My capture was, regrettably, my fault and mine alone. I had grown complacent. I was situated in a location with much prey, and I stayed for too long. I have lived for hundreds of years, and I have hunted in many places. I have preyed upon men of every color and creed. I have always hidden my tracks, and never stayed in one place for too long. But I was lulled into a false sense of security. My home, a deep cavern, was what I thought no man would find me in. I should have fled when that woman entered my home. If she could find her way in, of course warriors could. I curse my foolishness, but I must look forward. The past cannot be undone. All of this happened a while ago. I can only estimate the length of time that has passed. I assume it to be a fortnight. 1 fortnight stuck in this prison. 1 fortnight too many. The men frequently take me from the room. They always do it the same way. A small part of the door is opened, and meat is thrown in. I devour it, for I am starving, always. I am rendered comatose moments afterwards. They have poisoned the food. In the brief seconds before I am unconscious, I can see the door open and men enter. I always awake in the same room, but in a different position from where I fainted. I know the men are taking me somewhere and returning me. I know not where they are taking me, nor what they are doing to me. The only way to avoid this would be not to eat the meat, and that is no option at all. My hunger will not allow it. Sometimes, the men try to speak to me. I can speak their simple language, of course, but I say nothing to them. I have no interest in doing so. Most of the time, the men leave me be. Sometimes, if I roar and bellow and strike at the walls too much, 5 men will enter the room and hit me with darts. I have attempted to attack them, but their strength is shocking. I have grown weak since I arrived here. The men wrapped my injured foot in something. I am unsure of what it is, or what nefarious purpose it serves. I live in fear. I fear man, whom I have preyed upon since I was created by the Great Spirit. Man, who have feared me, and indeed feared all Wendigos, now have made me feel fear. I fear their metal poles. I fear their size. I do not know why these ones are so big. A different tribe, perhaps. I am ashamed of myself for feeling this way. It is as if I am their pet. I often wonder where they get the meat from. It is man meat, without a doubt. They tried to feed me other things, but I can only consume man meat. These men must kill and butcher their own kind to get it. Perhaps they consume other men as well. I shudder at the depravity of it. The thought of killing, or even worse, consuming my own kind, other Wendigos, makes me sick. I don't know what the people will do to me. I have heard a story of a Wendigo that was slaughtered by men. They chopped off his legs, then later cut him to small pieces. I imagine they will do something similar to me. Today, when I awoke, I found paper in my room. So, I write this message. I write it in my native tongue, which only Wendigos know, and is simply nonsensical gibberish to humans. I have no way of knowing where this message will go, but it is my only option. If any of my kind somehow finds this, please, save me. I will forever be in your debt. Dr. K. Bowman. The preceding transcript was written by a man named Ned Terrell, Canadian, 2.05 m tall, 34 years old. Worked as a dentist. Him and his girlfriend went missing 3 months and 4 days ago and were presumed dead. Mr. Terrell lived a normal life prior to his disappearance. He received a proper education, was never abused, never had mental health issues, or any sort of violent behavior. All of his friends and family spoke of him quite highly until they were informed of his actions. Those who knew Mr. Terrell noted that he had always been quite fascinated with superstitions, legends, and mythological creatures. On multiple occasions, he would go on trips to attempt to find these supernatural beings. He has traveled to Scotland to look for the Loch Ness Monster, America to find several creatures including Bigfoot and Mothman, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore to find a Pontianak, as well as several other countries. His most recent interest was the Wendigo. The Wendigo is a Native American legend, but is quite well known in Canada as well. It is somewhat surprising that Mr. Terrell never went looking for the Wendigo earlier than he did. The stories behind the Wendigo vary quite a fair amount. It is typically said to be a spirit that possesses humans and drives them to cannibalism, but it's also said to be its own individual creature which consumes human beings. Some sources also say that humans who resort to cannibalism to survive turn into Wendigos. Wendigos, despite often being depicted as anthropomorphic deer-like creatures, are actually traditionally described as giant humanoids that smell extremely foul and can cause a chill, and in some iterations, a blizzard, wherever they go. Mr. Terrell went looking for the Wendigo on April the 6th. He went with his girlfriend, Iris Hall, 31. They went to Ontario and explored deep into a forest that will remain unnamed. They informed their family and friends that they would be gone for at least a week, maybe a few days more. An extreme blizzard hit the area they were in, and their families were worried. After they still had not returned after 1 week and 5 days, they were reported as missing. After nearly a month of searching, they were not found and were declared dead. 2 weeks after this, it was noted that several children were reported missing from towns near the forest. 20 children in 4 days. They found the bodies of several of the missing children partially consumed. The worst was a 6-year-old boy, who I won't name out of respect for him and his family. I saw the body and, while I won't go into detail, I will note that the damage was so severe it was presumed that a bear had attacked him. Wildlife control was called in to reduce the animal population of any predators in the area. Well over 50 men were deployed and, over the course of the next couple of months, tranquilized and relocated dozens of wolves and bears. But the attacks never stopped or even slowed. While almost all the missing people were children, a very small number of adults also disappeared. 3 to be precise. 2 men, both aged 23, and 1 woman, aged 21. It is worth noting that all the adults who disappeared were extremely small in stature and could be mistaken for large children as opposed to adults. Finally, 3 wildlife control rangers happened across a cave with several bodies surrounding it. They entered. Upon entering, they found Mr. Terrell. He was standing over the remains of a young girl, who has since been identified. She was 12 and was out for a hike when she passed by the cave and was taken. She lived about 2 hours away from the cave. Once again, I will not reveal her name. Due to Mr. Terrell recording everything he and his girlfriend did on the trip with an action camera, we know exactly what happened. The camera was found in the same cave as Mr. Terrell, and there are several videos recovered. The severely decomposed body of Iris Hall was also found. The videos are as follows. Videos 1 to 13. All are simply videos of Terrell and Hall exploring the wilderness. They come across as very likable, good-natured, and simply looking for fun. They kiss a lot, laugh a lot, and really love one another. In videos 8, 9, and 12, they speak about marriage and children. Video 14. After about a week of exploring, Terrell and Hall are ready to head back to civilization. Unfortunately, one of the worst blizzards in history occurred on that day. It would last for several weeks. Weather reports cite the temperature as dropping to 33 degrees Celsius. They took shelter in a cave. They are still extremely upbeat and perfectly composed. They had camping equipment and still had enough supplies for another few days. They make a few jokes, set up a small camp slightly far away from the mouth of the cave, then turn the camera off. Video 15. A video of Terrell and Hall exploring the cave. It is quite large. Terrell mentions the Wendigo, and says it might be in there with them. He says that the cannibalism aspect of the Wendigo is what disturbs him the most, and that the very thought of it makes him somewhat nauseous. Hall questions how a human could sink to such depths. The video cuts off abruptly for no reason, presumably a malfunction. Video 16. Another video of the duo exploring the cave. Iris suddenly slips and screams. Terrell rushes towards her. He carries her back to the camp. He pulls the camera off his head. It ends up face down in the dirt. The video lasts for several hours before turning off, presumably due to the camera running out of battery. Video 17. Terrell facing the camera. He is noticeably upset. He remarks that Hall's leg is severely injured, the blizzard's still going on, and their food is gone. He says he doesn't recall eating any, and Iris doesn't either. He stares blankly at something off-screen for several seconds, then turns the camera off. Video 18. A goodbye video from Terrell and a barely conscious Hall. Only the upper half of Hall can be seen, due to the lower half of her being covered by a blanket. It is impossible to know the extent of the injury she suffered from. Given how much blood is on the blanket, it can only be assumed it is very severe. The two genuinely think they're going to die. Video 19. Another video with Terrell facing the camera. He is scarily thin now. Skin like paper, sunken cheeks, blank expression. He says the blizzard has been going on for a long time and shows no signs of stopping. He remarks that he is starving to death. He talks about the Wendigo and mutters something under his breath. The word cannibalism is barely audible. Once again, he looks at something off camera. He turns the video off. Video 19 is the final video, but we can easily deduce what happens. Left with no choice, Mr. Terrell cannibalizes Iris Hall. He has a psychotic breakdown. He cannot live with being a cannibal, and to save himself, convinces himself that he is not a cannibal. He is a Wendigo, and eating humans is simply something he must do. The blizzard ends approximately 6 hours after this. Terrell begins his murder spree. I would now like to cross-reference the story Mr. Terrell wrote with facts that actually occurred. The note was written in French, Mr. Terrell's first language. Firstly, he calls the people he killed men and women, despite them all being children. He also said that the men who took him were much larger than the ones he normally hunted. Of course, this is due to the former being adults. He may have done this to lessen his guilt. He hunted exclusively children due to how easy they are to capture. Upon finding Mr. Terrell, the Rangers panicked and tranquilized Mr. Terrell. Despite being injected with enough tranquilizer to kill an average male, he survived. They threw him into a truck meant for animals and immediately drove to the nearest police station. He was placed in a holding cell. When he awoke, he attacked the bars of the cell. One wildlife control ranger was still present to give a statement to the police. He still had his tranq rifle with him and shot Mr. Terrell yet again due to the panic he was in. He was not charged for anything, as it was a rather understandable reaction. After the holding cell, Mr. Terrell was later transferred directly to our mental facility and is currently locked in a room just down the hall. The process of getting him in here was a little scuffed, but we made it happen. We had to. He is without a doubt the most dangerous patient I've ever seen, but also the most fascinating. We feed him exclusively pork, as he spits out anything else we give him. I find it rather interesting that Mr. Terrell called the tranq rifles metal poles and the truck a metal carriage. Without a doubt he knows what guns and trucks are. He seems to feign ignorance about many things. For instance, not knowing how much time has passed. There is a clock in his room. This shows how far his delusion goes. He has convinced himself that he knows nothing about human technology. Why would he? He's a Wendigo. He also said that he had a foot injury from being hit with a rock. While he did have a hairline fracture, it was nothing major. We gave him a cast. He doesn't seem very fond of it. We do frequently remove Mr. Terrell from his room, but only so we can clean him. He won't do it himself, even though his room has a bathroom. Not to mention, we have to treat his infections and injuries. Living in a cave and eating people for a couple of months is not good for you. As for the sheet of paper he wrote on, I had it placed in his room today. Why? Sometimes, people write down exactly what's wrong with them. Terrell will stay locked up for the rest of his life, and probably die still thinking he's a Wendigo. Nothing anyone has said or done can convince him otherwise. Myself, other doctors, and his friends and family. At least, the few friends and family still willing to see him. Terrell doesn't respond to anything we say. He's pretending not to understand us. We have come to the end of the story of Ned Terrell. Well, maybe not quite. He's already turned into an urban legend, and someday someone will probably make one of those serial killer documentaries about him. And after that, a horror movie that'll say based on true events. It'll probably be called The Canadian Cannibal or something equally as tasteless. Another thing, Terrell is not entirely unique. Wendigo psychosis, a condition which causes humans to resort to cannibalism, has been observed before. To my knowledge, however, no case of it has ever been officially studied. I believe Terrell will be the first, although we should probably rename the ailment to Terrell's disorder or something along those lines. He is simply an insane man, that is all. Certainly not possessed by an evil spirit of any kind. I mean, come on. Wendigos? There's no such thing. Now if you'll excuse me, I must shut my windows. The temperature just took an absolute dive. It's rather chilly now. I think there's a blizzard coming in. 7th story. Wendigo. I grew up in the northernmost part of Wisconsin on a Native American reservation. As a Native American kid, you grow up learning a lot about the mythology of our people, many mythical creatures and spirits, but I was always pretty skeptical, especially when it came to the monsters like Bigfoot or the Mashibiju. But all of that changed one day. It was mid-December and it was freezing out, had to be around -10 Fahrenheit. My friend David and I were at his family's house for a dinner. After the dinner was finished, his grandmother asked us if we would go to her cabin and chop some logs. She was going out there while her husband went hunting, and she wanted it to be nice and warm. Of course, we told her we would. What else could we do? So we throw on our jackets and boots and headed out. It wasn't a far, less than a mile if we went straight into the woods instead of walking the road. So that's what we did. Trekking through snow that is at times thigh-high isn't fun in the best of situations, but as I said, it was like -10. When we finally arrived, we went inside and started a fire with the few remaining split logs and warmed up a bit. The crackling flames were peaceful, but David kept pacing and looking around uneasily. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me that he felt like he was being watched. I told him that was ridiculous and that we should start chopping wood before it got dark, so we got the axe and went outside and began to chop. We were doing that for about an hour when we first heard it. Very faintly, it sounded like a girl screaming. We thought it must have been the wind, so we went back to the logs. A few more minutes went by and we heard it again. This time there was no mistaking it. A girl was yelling for help. Then the wolf howled. We looked at each other and ran in the direction of the scream. We got to a spot where all the snow was packed down and there were paw prints all around. We began to yell for her, tried to get her to answer. That is when I heard the noise that haunts my dreams. The only way it can be described is an angry, hateful shriek. And it was close. David started running before me, but I caught up pretty quick. I was mentally kicking myself for leaving the axe back at the cabin, but that is where we were heading. Once we got back, we would be fine. At least that's what I told myself. It didn't quite work out that way. Before we could get into the cabin, David fell. I turned to help him up, but he wasn't there. Just a long drag mark. I yelled for him, but got no response. I started moving in the direction of the mark when I got hit. I didn't see what hit me, but I sure felt it. I was knocked off my feet, and my chest felt like it was on fire. I glanced down and saw my jacket was shredded and blood was everywhere. I couldn't breathe. I felt myself about to pass out. Then I saw it. It was tall, had to be about 9 feet, covered in thick, dirty white fur, a mouth full of fangs but no lips, clawed hands covered in blood, and its sunken eyes were pale yellow. I didn't know what it was, but it no longer mattered. I was losing blood quickly. How could I survive this? When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. My chest was bandaged, and there was a police officer by my bed. When he saw that I was awake, he asked me what happened. I told him everything. He told me that they found David's jacket and boots in the woods, but there was no sign of him. The doctor told me that I was attacked by a bear, and that I had hallucinated from blood loss. Eventually, I recovered enough to be released. As far as I know, they never found David, and I haven't gone in the woods since that day. Well, that's my story. Enjoy. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.